So bear with me a little bit because I need to pass the notes on my computer while I also pass it here. So if there's some desync, but yeah. So welcome to my talk, Talking with Programmers 101, a guide for designers, artists, producers, and everyone else. So a little bit about me. I am João. I am from Lisbon, Portugal. I've lived in Sweden for the last 3 years, but now I'm back. I've been making games since around 2015. I worked on mobile, VR, PC, and console titles, and this in indie studios and also like in big AAA studios. And currently, I'm a senior gameplay developer at Studio Ellipsis here in Lisbon. We are not here to talk about how to have better soft skills. We are not here to talk about how to be more liked or respected or how to influence others. Sure, I will still talk a lot about soft skills, but the goal of this talk is to give you tips to help you maximize productivity and product quality, and to do so by minimizing friction when talking with programmers while boosting their motivation by giving them the necessary tools to achieve the project's needs. So just before we start, do we have any programmers in the room? If so, can you raise your hand? Okay, so I hope I don't trigger a lot of wartime memories. And the other ones, I assume you are not programmers. Can you raise your hand as well? Okay, nice. So I hope you go away from this talk at least with one good tip that you can use right away. All right, so I will present you with 3 acts over the course of this talk, each with a different scenario involving programmers and other disciplines. All of them are fiction, even though they are inspired by common frustration points that were shared to me by developers, by programmers employed in studios of varied dimensions. So welcome to the world premiere of Code and Order, a series that explores the intricate interactions between programmers and everyone else. Now, I am a programmer as well. I am no writer. There's other writers in the room here. So expect this pilot episode to have a subpar plot with unidimensional characters, but hopefully the message still gets across. So, sorry. So let's start with act number 1, one of us. So this circle right here is our game. And one day, it broke, and it broke hard. Was it due to something like a big change someone did, or was it just because of the sum of all the small changes that people did over time? Well, nobody had answers. So the best of the thinkers and decision makers were assembled to find a way to glue the game back together. And after several meetings across several days, this team came up with the solution, properly documented, estimated, ready to be requested. To the programmer, who was not part of any discussion so far. So the team knew that their solution was brilliant, and most of all, simple, which could only mean that it would be very easy to implement and not take a lot of time, most probably a day. But the programmer was not buying it. They could see the hidden complexity behind the request, even though it was a solid one. So the programmer's rough estimate was 2 weeks. Well, 2 weeks was much more the initial estimation of just 1 day. However, there was no other way. This was the solution, after all. And so the programmer gets to work, and 2 weeks later, the requested solution was delivered. The game was no longer broken. Right? Well, wrong. Turns out that the requested solution did not solve the issue after all, at least not all of it. But all is fine, as the programmer is now handed an updated request that will for sure restore the circular integrity of the game. The problem is the programmer still does not know exactly what they are fixing. Yes, they know that the game is broken, but they do not know how or why. Which brings us to our first tip of this talk, present the problem, not the solution. First of all, the obvious solution is not always the best one. Let's say you want to open a padlock. Well, you obviously need a key for the job, right? Well, technically, yes. But for sure there are other ways, like using a bolt cutter or picking the lock with a paperclip. Yes, maybe they are not the correct tools, but maybe they are the ones you have. So by presenting the issue instead, you give the programmer the space to come up with the best solution. And by best solution, I mean one that answers the questions raised by the problem in the cheapest, most robust, and most efficient way, while still accommodating the different disciplines' desires. If you already have a bolt cutter, maybe in using it, it's better than having to forge a key. And even if all you are looking for is to make a small change, there's no direct complexity correlation between a conceptual and an architectural change. And maybe your small conceptual change, like, well, I need a key to open a lock, is not that small after all, because you actually need to forge that key. And there is a simple yet big thing you can do to make all of this happen naturally, which is our tip number 2, involve programmers in early definition. You should have programmers sit in definition meetings as early as possible. And when I mean early as possible, it doesn't mean on the first meeting, it just means on the first one that makes sense. Because this ensures that potential problems due to technical limitations are taken into account on the definition of the feature or project you want to do. By adding a buffer between where the definition occurs and who has to make the definition a reality, in this case, the programmer, you are making vital information harder or impossible to achieve. So think of it as a broken phone problem. The information that the programmer gets will never have the same quality as if it was given to him firsthand. Also, how many more meetings can you fit in your calendar? Because in order to mitigate the loss of information, you will have to have extra meetings. And above all, the more your programmer understands the intent of what you are trying to do and how it fits into the big picture, the better they will be able to help you out. A common complaint amongst programmers is that they often feel that impactful decisions are being made elsewhere and that they wish they could be more involved. They could be more parts of the discussion, have the chance to express concerns before final decisions are made. And when I say final, we're going to talk about it in a bit. In an ideal world, in the scenario that, like the scenario that we can see here, you have this person A that has a request, goes to person B, and then person B goes to the programmer. And in an ideal world, you have 2 meetings here. The issue comes when the programmer has a concern. And so the programmer raises this concern with person B goes to person A, and you kind of get in the loop. So what I propose instead is what we can see on the right side, that actually the programmer, person A, and person B can sit in one meeting, and they can have a common discussion about the request, which will guarantee that there are less doubts about what work needs to be done and in which way. So you are going to have, the ideal scenario will be 2 meetings, in this one you have 1 meeting. But I bet that you can maybe make it like in 1 meeting here, and then there's not going to be 2 on the other one. There is another benefit to involving programmers early on, which is to give them a chance to listen to how you think, which brings us to our tip number 3, loop programmers into your logic. As an example, we have an animator here who is thinking about how to fix some animation flow. And they suggest that the animation is broken down into 3 parts, with the last one being swapped out depending on context. Now, when this animator thinks out loud, they are not just expressing a set of ideas, they are also showcasing their thought process, essentially how their brain works. And just from hearing the animator, the programmer more or less understands what needs to be done even before the request is properly formulated. Programmers are usually good, or even very good, at reading between the lines, since that is a lot of what we do, for instance, when bug solving. We need to listen to the game and try to read beyond what it is telling us on the screen. So on situations like this, programmers will be able to identify a solution that answers the need but also adapts to the form of who needs to use it. In other words, this is an excellent way to get programmers to not only understand what you need, but also how you want it, so they can provide you solutions that cater to your preferred way of working. Another good thing that you can do is to make sure that everyone has a base understanding of the topic. So tip number 4, set a common language. So by involving programmers and other disciplines early on, the needs to explicitly set a common language become lower because we are creating this language together. However, there are still things you can do. You can set up a lexicon for the feature to reduce communication friction, as this helps code come up with naming or classes for variables that not break away from the terms everyone else is using. Something that happened to me in the past, and probably to all the programmers, that sometimes you have people discussing a feature, you don't know what they are talking about, and then you realize that it's actually the feature you coded, just that they are using completely different terms. And feel free to include discipline-specific concepts that might be obvious for you, but not so much for others. For instance, user story. What is the texture? What is the code class? The lexicon is an immensely valuable piece of information for any new joiner to the team, or for other teams that may need to use your feature or even inherit it. And all we discussed so far are active steps to break down silos, our tip number 5. Silos are bad. It's as simple as that. They can contribute for us versus them environment. They are great increasers of communication friction, and they actively reduce team spirit. Programmers, designers, producers, artists, animators, sound designers, etc., etc. In the end, we are all the same, game developers. And we all want the same. To deliver the best game we can deliver, and possibly leave our mark in the industry, impacting as many players as we possibly can. Together, we are more than the sum of our parts, and we need to leverage on that at all times. Okay, let's move on to our second act, the request. So there is a need to add the most excellent character to the game, which in this universe is somehow a code-only task. That's where my writing skills kind of plummet. So the programmer does not know much about the character, but they certainly know like what excellent means, right? So they promptly accept the challenge and get to work. And they develop the most mesmerizing character, at least in their minds, just according to what was requested. The most excellent character. However, the requester really, really wishes this character had a beard, which is a problematic request. And can you see the issue? So the issue is, besides me not being an amazing writer, is that programmers are sculptors in this universe. And our character is made of hard marble stone, and you can only subtract from it, not add. So either way, the programmer gets to work. They need to redo it, but it was faster this time because they had previously acquired knowledge from the first time they did it. And I guess the result still looks kind of like the most excellent character, but with a beard. But now the requester wants a hat, and the programmer will have to redo everything once more for the same reasons as before. But thankfully, the requester ensures this is the last change. They actually promise it. And this somewhat eases the programmer internal pain. One last redo, it will be even faster. Well, it is never the last change. And so the requester and the programmer get stuck in this loop till they land in what the requester had in mind from the beginning, which turns out was not the most excellent marble statue, but the most excellent plastic figure with easy to swap out parts. Which brings us to tip number 6, be specific. So programmers are often presented with final designs that end up changing with time. And this is fine and expecting. It's game dev, right? It's an iterative process. But accommodating changes to code that was written as final can be hard. And usually harder than just changing the design intent itself, thinking about the character with a beard or the character with a hat. So if you cannot be specific, point it out. Say that your character has no beard by default, but that it may change. Because due to time or scope constraints, programmers need to pick which features need modular solutions, and without knowing the need is there, whatever estimate provided to production will be wrong. If this programmer says that they can do Michelangelo's David in 1 day, but then they actually get stuck in this loop till they deliver Mr. Potato Head, after 2 weeks, they for sure provided the wrong estimate to production, which then impacts everything else. And so to reduce repeated requests of the same time, it is important to promote generic solutions, our tip number 7. Programmers are often lazy. This doesn't mean that we don't like to work, it just means that we want to be very specific and very economic on the changes we make to our code base. And so we will not build entire generic system unless there's a clear reason for it. And the reason can be explicit, for instance, saying that you want the character with swappable parts, or implicit and informed by the present needs. If for whatever reason there is no established design, agglomerating similar requests or hinting that there might be the need to do something similar in the future can greatly inform the programmer on what solution to develop. For instance, we have the programmer gets one task that says, hey, add an animation trigger, and then gets another one saying, add an animation trigger. And actually, if you have all of these 4 tasks in the backlog, the programmer can look at this and say, well, actually, I'm just going to make a system so you can add the animation trigger, and you don't depend on programmer's time anymore. And especially for producers, you may have a better overview of existing tasks, and you can be proactive in agglomerating them. Yes, you may fail sometimes, you may not understand that some things are the same thing, but, well, necessary space. You are the one who can ensure that the programmer has the necessary space to develop a generic solution that, although may slow development down in the short term, can save countless hours of work in the end. Tip number 8, be persistent. Programmers will push back on your requests, but do not be afraid when they do so. With the iteration loop not being as fast as it is in other disciplines, programmers are naturally resistant to changes to existing solutions, especially because I can guarantee you that all programmers passed by situations like the one I described in this act. So sometimes it feels like we as programmers need to be the ones kind of ruining the party. Everyone is like, oh yeah, let's put this thing in the game, and programmers need to say, well, that's actually going to be like a big change. And we need to do it. Even more so if those changes are not well explained. You have to get programmers on your side. And you do so by showing why your request is valid, why it will improve the game, and what are the odds that things might change again. Make them work with you and not for you. We now reach our final act, true colors. So our requester on the left has a clear goal on a feature they want to achieve, and they take their time to explain it to the programmer on the right, and then they request a delivery estimate for it. And the programmer understood the vision, but has some concerns about it. Unfortunately, this specific programmer talks about things at a very, very low level, meaning that for the requester, they sound more or less like this. And so the programmer goes on about data, quantum systems, complicated algorithms, how to land on Mars, and other tech terms that nobody understands, and for sure, not the requester. Because everything that the requester heard was gibberish, they just completely dismiss it, and they request again what they want to know. Yeah, sure, okay, but what's the delivery estimate? And of course, this frustrates the programmer, who feels like they were not listened to. But either way, they get to work and deliver exactly what was requested. So sometime later, the requester and the programmer bump into each other. And the requester informs the programmer that, well, actually, the feature that they had previously spoken about had too many issues and broke things elsewhere, so they just decided to cut it altogether. No wonder, comments the programmer, they are clearly not surprised. They anticipated these issues and they tried to communicate them, but no one listened. But fret not. There are plenty of programming tasks back in the backlog to keep the programmer entertained and motivated. After all programmers love to code. Except this one, maybe. Tip number 9, listen. Every good conversation starts with listening. Do not shut down technical conversation. I know it kind of sucks, but never do it. Because usually, programmers are trying to provide better visibility of their work or of the underlying system. Their goal is to give you a better understanding of how something functions and why that impacts the feasibility of what you want to achieve. Talking as experts, programmers may not always realize that some information is not general knowledge outside of the programming bubble, which is where we spend most of our time. Besides that, it can sometimes take a while to reformat your way of thinking and expressing ideas. A little bit what happens when you change like the language that you're speaking, and the first words that come out sound harder to say than the ones that follow. And especially with less experienced programmers, they may lack the skills altogether to translate things into layman's terms. It is a very important skill, but it's something that we learn on the job and with time. It's not like we have a subject in university or school about how to do that. If you actively listen to someone, you increase the chances that someone will actively listen to you in the future. Now, listening is not the same as hearing. It is an active process. It requires focus and ongoing repackaging of absorbed information. So, of course, for you to be able to repackage this information, you need to understand it. And that's why you need to ask for a less technical explanation. It is totally fine if you do not understand everything what the programmer says. And I'm going to let you in on a secret. We also don't understand everything you say. We all have different responsibilities and thus different knowledge in different areas. And programmers will not think less of you if you seek to understand more. We are knowledge seekers. That's what we do for work, essentially. Trying to understand why something is broken, trying to understand how to make something work. So it is actually great if you can ask for things to be presented in an alternative way, which not only helps you comprehend the current topic more, but also eases future conversations, because the programmer will understand what you know, what you don't know, what kind of language you want things to be conveyed. Okay, sorry. There's one behind here. Yeah, and do not say you understand unless you actually do. I think like the main issue for programmers with things changing all the time is that we are not really used to it. We mostly talk with computers and we don't always understand them. Sometimes they do things that we don't understand why they are doing it, but they're never lying. Like what they say, we just take them as face value. So if you say that you understand, most programmers will say, cool, let's move on. Very nice programmers will ask, are you sure? And so yeah, so programmers are a little bit like when you see like these memes where things are taken like very, very literally. Tip number 11, trust your programmer. Now, programmers own the technical side of a system, so sometimes you need to have blind faith about the concerns they raise, even if you do not fully understand them. Don't trust them when they say that something is impossible, because everything is possible and sky is the limit. But trust them when they say something is very hard or complex. Even though everything is technically possible, it might not be true in the current context, either for scope, complexity, or timeline reasons. And this means that you need to be open to compromise on limitations. Sometimes the difference between going from a good enough solution to an excellent one can mean a great increase in development time, and more often than not, that missing functionality is something the game and you can live without. Tip number 12, respect their work. So for now, most programmers are not ChatGPT. They are still like flesh and bones. And this means that requests should be meaningful so that meaningful work can be produced. Now, programmers value their work in terms of quality and purpose. And what this means is that even if something is stellar from a tech point of view, it is ultimately meaningless if it serves no purpose. It's as if code exists only when it compiles and runs. And what this all means is that if you treat this code as disposable and easily changeable, you will be constantly breaking the purpose of their work. And eventually, the programmer will think the same way as you. They will lose respect for the outcome of their work and start delivering with less and less quality. And as I have observed many times, an unmotivated programmer eventually breaks or leaves. And that is usually a cog in the machine you cannot afford to lose. Now, while this tip could be do not assume anything about anyone or anything, let's go a little bit more specific. And with our tip number 13, do not assume programmers love to code. Now, many do, and that is awesome. But others are simply using code as a tool for game making, like me. And when I started out my career, I started in random consultancy company, like not game dev. And essentially, we had to work. We had to be allocated to different clients. And the people who had to allocate me would always ask, like, okay, but what is your motivation? And they would ask me in like this: are you motivated by C++? Are you motivated by front end with AngularJS? Do you want to use Ionic for app development? And I never really understood the question, because my answer was always the same. Like, I'm motivated by the project, and I want to make games. So if you actually put me on a client where I don't need to code, I don't care. I want to make games. And I thought for many years that this was an handicap, because I thought that, well, good programmers, they love to code. They get super excited whenever a new C++ standard comes out. But then I found out that actually I worked with brilliant programmers that don't really like to code that much. And I worked with brilliant programmers that like to code more or less, and with brilliant programmers that love to code. And so what this feels is that, like, the way that I feel about coding in programming, which is just a small part because most of what we do is problem solving, it's not rare. And in the same way, the contrary is neither. That the programmer gets most of their motivation from the tech that they get to use. A friend of mine told me recently that they were working on a game that was not exciting as a product, but they were using a lot of emerging tech, and that was super cool. So this also means that the motivation and the drive changes depending on the project as well. And in the end, that means, and this is the final tip, and like if you forget all the others, this is the one I want you to remember. Each programmer is a different programmer. So, for example, you can ask a programmer if a feature makes sense to them. And some programmers are the happiest with only handling implementation, fully trusting you to come up with what needs to be done. While others like to share their views on how the proposed changes might affect the player experience, how the changes may clash with an existing system, or how an alternative solution might be a better option. Others will be seeking to be more deeply involved in the decision and definition process so they can achieve their full potential and provide the best solution for the feature or project. And for sure, if you keep asking the same question, you will get different answers. And hopefully, this diversity on ways of thinking only keeps expanding, as we still have ways to go to achieve proper diversity in the programming space, with only around 2 in every 10 programmers identifying as women, and similar statistics showing that there is not enough ethnic representation. Try to break preconceptions you might have about what a programmer is and what motivates a programmer. Think instead about when and where during the course of the development of a feature or game would a programmer's technical expertise be of best use. For instance, if a programmer is very strong technically, they might enjoy optimization tasks, which are very important when wrapping up development. On the other hand, if a programmer is very creative and has an eye for design, they might be best suited for a pre-production phase where there's more space for experimentation. You will encounter programmers at different levels of communication skills and sensibilities. For some, you will need to employ all the tips in this talk, for others, just a few, and for a very rare few, maybe none at all. It is important to adapt the form of your message to the programmer who is in front of you. And parallel to your efforts, programmers also need to improve a lot and try to be better communicators. After all, it does take 2 to tango. But that is a subject for another episode. Thank you.
Amazing. Okay. If someone there has questions?
No. Yes, if you need a reminder on the tips.
Hey there. Great presentation. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
I have a question related to just what you said about every programmer is different. They have different levels of communication. And considering that on a daily activity, let's say refinements, technical meetings, whatever, how do you manage those differences? Because let's have 2 fixed scenarios here. The first one is a meeting where there's let's say the more communicative design programmer that you make a question and he tells you his perspective, but only him. The other ones will be quiet. And there's other scenario where there's no communicative developer. How would you manage those 2 scenarios? How do you manage the first one without demotivating the person that is giving you the perspective, but motivating the others to speak too, and not being in the shadow of the first one? And how would you manage the situation where no one gives you feedback, basically?
Yeah. So I think so one of the things I say in one slide is involve programmers as early as possible. One thing that I don't say is it's not early as possible. It's in the first meeting. It's actually no, depending on the programmer, it makes sense maybe if it's in the first meeting or not. So in that sense, you need to understand why they are not communicating, and sometimes they're not communicating because they're fine. They just want there's a lot of programmers I work with. It's they don't really want to say things are wrong or correct. They don't want to change things. They just want their work. They want their work to come. They want to do it fast, and that's it. And if it's just that, maybe there's nothing to really fix that. Of course, some communication is always nice, right? But if on the other hand, then they are not communicating for some reason, then yes, you need to understand the reasons. You need to understand maybe on this scenario where you have one that speaks more than the others. Are the others not comfortable to share because maybe they don't have the same level of communication skills? And I don't know exactly how you would fix it. Maybe not all the programmers need to sit in all the meetings. Maybe you can separate them. There is one thing that happens a lot is there are meetings that I can give an example that I attend as a programmer. Let's say we used to have in a studio I used to work before. We had a big stand-up with a lot of people, and I wouldn't speak much in the stand-up because of the stand-up of 20 people. No one is working on my feature, and I don't need to actually convey information to anyone. So if you go to just that meeting, I'm a programmer that doesn't talk. If you go to a meeting about my feature, I'm talking all the time. So understanding of like, are those people that are in the meeting, does it make sense that they are all there? And if maybe if you just put the ones that actually overlap in terms of like the information that you'll be sharing with each other, maybe you will get them to speak more. But it really depends on the person that you have.
So I was wondering if the programmers are busy and I'm working on a design document for them, and the idea is basically to save them time later on to think how this tool that they will create will need to be designed. So I would like to involve them early on, but for now I'm talking just with my creative director because he told me they're so busy on other things. It would be helpful for somebody to start thinking ahead about these decisions, you know. Mm-hmm. And so in this case, do you think I should still break the silos a bit early on, or is it better to wait for the proper timing?
Yeah, I think so. I think you can still break the silos and be transparent on the information and why did you arrive there, without even making it in the beginning. Let's say like this: you have like a certain issue, and you design a solution for this issue. It's not the only one; it's a solution you came up with. If on the documentation of this solution, at least you leave a space where it's like, well, this was the actual issue, and this is what I'm trying to do here. When programmers read that, they will understand your solution, but they will also understand why you arrived there, and maybe they can go and say, well, like what you say makes sense, but actually, if this is the issue, there is another way of doing it, or actually, this specific point you are proposing here, we can make it in another way because we already have some other tech. So you don't need. Definitely don't take from here that like you need to get programmers in meetings all the time. It's more like involve them, but it can be in a passive way. So it's like don't gatekeep the information, especially about what the issue is, because that's what usually makes things hard. And sometimes maybe you were going to propose something that makes sense conceptually, but actually there was already a system that we could leverage, change a little bit, and make it in a day, let's say.
So do you think it would be a good idea for each section of the document to add a little, start of a conversation, like, this is flexible, this is more something that we need, or this is the problem we solve, this is a proposal, but let them know that in the document that, some of these things are up to change and according to their input.
Yeah, I would say like you can start with essentially like a declaration of intention. Like, what are you trying to do? Like, how are you going to do it? It's also important because that's what needs to be done. But like, the reason why the document exists is because of this issue. So if you declare like, well, I'm trying to fix this, or I'm trying to like get us a tool that will make us do animation faster. I don't know. Like, if you can declare that. That gives a much better overview than sometimes just having like everything super specified in terms of design.
Makes sense. Thanks you so much.
Thank you.
More questions? Oh.
Hey, I guess this pertains to number 10 about asking for a less technical explanation, right? So I've had interactions in the past where programs can be a bit stubborn because I guess they kind of get the feeling like if they dump it down for you, then they won't explain it as good as they possibly could, right? So how would you like to be approached about this? Like if I'm trying to ask you, okay, dude, I'm not really understanding what you're trying to say, but you're like, yeah, but if I don't say it this way, like you won't get it, right? So, and then you're kind of in an impasse here, right?
Yeah, so I feel tempted to answer like you need to break them, like kind of like you need to keep insisting, and it's kind of this thing of like be persistent and don't be afraid. It's like, just keep asking for it till it's good enough for you. Because what is more important here, it's not about like the programmer's ego. It's not about like what the programmer thinks of you. Yes, it's cool if people like have a good relationship, right? But in the end, what is more important is that you both understand what the issue is. So programmers can be stubborn, and for sure, like this is like I made this talk because there's not a lot of talks about how to talk with programmers. There's a lot of talks how programmers should talk, and you can see why there's a lot of talks of that, because usually the issue is more on the programming side, right? But yeah, there's not much you can do. I would just say like insist and don't let it go, because sometimes like what happens, I think like eventually people like you are asking for it, the explanations always come like super technical. and you just give up because it's like you have more stuff to do, right? But this will, at one point or another, you're gonna pay for it. Like, so yeah. So just insist, or like, or
It's
just
super
really
annoying.
go,
Got it.
yeah, or just really go like, explain me as if I am 10-year-old. Explain me like, I don't know, like, grab an example. Explain me as if this was cars and dinosaurs. And like, let's talk about it. Yeah.
Hello. First of
Hey.
all, thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
So I want to make a question from the other perspective as a programmer. If you try to explain how the thing you're going to code works, and you see that the other person didn't understand very well what you were trying to say, should you insist, like if the other person gave you a response like a yes, but you can see in their face that you really didn't understand, should you insist and you say to if they, can I say it in other words? Or?
Yeah, so there are two outcomes you can choose there. One is the one where like essentially like you save yourself, where it's like, well, you said yes, so bye. And the other one is like if you understand, well, this person is actually not getting it for some reason. You can see there's some doubt. I would say it's better to insist, like and to get that. And of course, like there is. It's not insisting always saying the same words, right? Like you need to insist. Okay, I didn't understand like this. Let me try to break it down some other way. I understand the person who is in front of you. Maybe explain it like with terms that makes sense for them, right? It's it's a musician. Let me try to grasp some analogy with music and explain it in that way. And I think like as a programmer, there are cool talks you can see. One is from an ex-colleague of mine called Scott Lagrasta, and Scott used to be a game designer. So essentially, he was a senior game designer, and then he became a junior programmer, and now he's a senior programmer. So it's cool because he has like this thing. And his talk is called "How to Be a Lovable Programmer." I think it's something like that. And essentially, it goes a lot on that, like how do you convey ideas? How do you kind of leave like a footprint on the things that you do so that people understand, even if they are not super technical? So yeah. But directly to your question, yeah, insist.
So you should adapt your speech to the person you're talking to.
Yeah, it's an effort from both ways. Like the programmer needs to try to adapt, the other person needs to try to adapt to the programmer according to sensibilities, what this person knows, doesn't know, seniority. But yeah, and this goes. I would say this goes like for everything in life. Like if you can have the empathy of like talking to the person who's in front of you in a different way, it helps a lot.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm representing art, and I figured out during the years working in art that it's quite easy to speak to tech art.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's enormous gap in between for me to reach the engineers. Each time speaking to engineers, I feel like 5 years old.
Yeah.
And it's very easy to speak to technical artists. But it seems that tech art should be somewhere really in between engineering and art. So for me, it's like tech art is very close, and engineering is that far that I cannot reach for real. Does that feel symmetrical from another side?
I would say it does, and I also would say that there are degrees of. There are some degrees of separation in engineering. For instance, if you can speak with tech art, you can probably speak still with someone who is more like on graphics programming, even like with someone on the gameplay side of things, because these are people who are, yes, they are coders, but they are very visual, right? But then if you go like deep down and you are like, oh, these are like engine programmers. They are not so much visual, right? They are more like interested like with things being optimized, things running well. Then it becomes harder to talk. There's not much I think you can do. It's more like again, like just try to always see if you can talk with them in a way that makes sense for both of you. Like a good example that I always give is so my girlfriend is Polish. I'm Portuguese. We speak English all the time, but I don't think it's correct English. Like I think like we found like some kind of English that makes sense for us, and like my girlfriend speaks broken Portuguese with my cats, and I also speak broken Portuguese with my cats. So you kind of find like a common language at some point, even if it's not the correct one. So I think like what's most important is that people can understand each other. And I don't think it's super important. It's like, no, this is not what you call this type of variable in code, or this is not what you call this texture, whatever in art. So like if you can talk in a way that makes sense for both of you, I think it's the only way. But there's unfortunately not like a pill that you can take and now you understand everything. So you just need to keep insisting, even with yourself.